Morning light filters through the leaded glass windows of a 19th century home in New Haven, Connecticut, where something that should not exist has taken up residence in the basement and refuses to leave. The academic streets surrounding Yale University have witnessed generations of scholars and students pass through their intersections, but the older residential neighborhoods that frame the campus hold darker stories beneath their colonial facades. Stories that no amount of enlightened education can fully explain away. In the 1970s, a family living in one of these historic properties began experiencing phenomena that would challenge every rational framework their educated minds could construct. And eventually, they would make a call that would bring Ed and Lorraine Warren to their door. The property in question stood in one of those New Haven neighborhoods where architecture tells the story of America itself. Federal period construction mixing with Victorian additions, buildings that had served multiple purposes across their long lives before settling into their current domestic configurations. This particular house dated to the early 19th century, and its history was typical of urban New England properties that had seen many lives pass through their rooms. For a period, it had operated as a rooming house serving university-affiliated individuals, a transient population of scholars and support staff who had occupied its rooms for weeks or months before moving on to other accommodations. By the mid-20th century, it had returned to single-family use, and it was in this configuration that the family at the center of this case moved in and began the process of making the old house their home. The first signs that something was wrong came not as dramatic events, but as atmospheric wrongness that the family members found difficult to articulate even to each other. Certain rooms in the house possessed a quality that made people reluctant to linger in them, even though nothing visible or measurable explained the aversion. The front parlor felt oppressive in a way that could not be blamed on poor lighting or inadequate ventilation. Family members found themselves choosing longer routes through the house to avoid passing through specific spaces, a behavioral adaptation that developed unconsciously before anyone acknowledged it explicitly. The basement was particularly affected, and the family began to notice that trips downstairs for laundry or storage were accomplished with increasing speed, as though some instinct was urging them to complete their business and return to the upper floors as quickly as possible. Then there was the smell. The basement developed an odor that no amount of cleaning could eliminate, a sourness that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves rather than from any identifiable source of contamination. Ventilation made no difference. Professional cleaning made no difference. The smell persisted as though it were a property of the space itself rather than something introduced by decay or mold or any other natural process. The family tried every practical solution their rational minds could devise, but the basement's smell remained, and with it came the growing acknowledgement that perhaps they were dealing with something that practical solutions could not address. The phenomena escalated gradually over a period of months. The knocking started in the walls of the front parlor, rhythmic and purposeful, coming from inside the plaster, where no pipes or structural elements could account for the sound. Family members heard voices that they initially attributed to neighbors, sound traveling through the old walls in ways that urban dwellers learned to tolerate. But the acoustic properties of the voices became increasingly impossible to rationalize. They seemed to originate from within the house itself, from rooms that were empty when the family investigated. And there was the conversation, a recurring event in the early morning hours when one family member would wake to the sound of voices in the next room, speaking just below the threshold of intelligibility, a conversation that seemed deliberately calibrated to prevent comprehension while making its presence unmistakably known. The family's intellectual background became a liability in this situation. Educated and analytical, they exhausted every rational explanation before allowing themselves to consider that they might be dealing with something paranormal. They consulted with contractors about the knocking sounds. They investigated the possibility of auditory hallucinations brought on by stress or environmental factors. They researched the acoustic properties of old buildings and the ways sound can travel through antique construction. But eventually, the explanations ran out, and a university chaplain who had connections to the New England Society for Psychic Research made a suggestion that the family finally accepted. They contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed Warren had a personal connection to New Haven that predated his paranormal investigation work. He had studied art at the Perry Art School, affiliated with Yale, and he knew the city's character in ways that gave him insight into cases that emerged from its older neighborhoods. When he and Lorraine arrived at the property, they brought decades of experience investigating haunted locations across New England. But they also brought a nuanced understanding of how educated households processed paranormal experiences and the particular challenges of working with families who had spent months trying to rationalize away what they were living through. Lorraine's psychic walkthrough of the property produced impressions that she found unusually difficult to disentangle. The house had accumulated layers of presence across its long history of occupation, residual emotional energy from the many lives that had unfolded within its walls. But beneath that accumulated layer, Lorraine identified something distinct and purposeful. There was an intelligent presence in the house, something aware of the current occupants and aware of the investigation now taking place. Lorraine traced this presence through the rooms and down into the basement, and in the northeast corner of that subterranean space, in the oldest section of the foundation, she found what she was looking for. The primary entity was anchored there, in that corner, and it was from that location that the influence over the household was emanating. Ed Warren documented Lorraine's findings and then conducted his own physical investigation of the basement. Using temperature measurement equipment, he identified an area of anomalous cold in precisely the location Lorraine had identified through her psychic examination. The correlation between psychic impression and physical measurement was the kind of confirmatory evidence that Ed considered particularly significant. The entity was not merely a psychological phenomenon experienced by sensitive individuals. It was producing measurable physical effects in the environment, and those effects corresponded exactly to the location Lorraine had identified as its anchor point. The danger assessment that Ed Warren provided to the family was moderate but genuine. The household had been living with sustained exposure to an adversarial entity for months, and that exposure was producing the kind of psychological wear that Warren had observed in many cases of established infestation. Family members reported increased irritability, a dulling of emotional life, and a pervasive sense of dread that had become so constant it felt normal. This normalization of distress was one of the most diagnostic signs that an entity had successfully established itself in a location and was exerting ongoing influence over the emotional climate of the household. The family's analytical approach, which had led them to seek rational explanations for an extended period, had inadvertently given the entity more time to consolidate its presence. Ed communicated this reality to the family with the directness he believed their intelligence deserved. They needed to understand what they were dealing with and why intervention was necessary now. The intervention was coordinated through the university chaplain who had made the initial referral. A priest with specific experience in residential exorcism was brought in to conduct the rite, and the Warrens participated as investigators and monitors throughout the process. The ceremony focused particular attention on the basement, and specifically on the northeast corner, where both Lorraine's psychic examination and Ed's physical measurements had identified the entity's anchor point. Lorraine monitored the entity's responses throughout the rite, reporting sustained resistance during the prayers directed at the basement corner, a period of spiritual struggle that both investigators and clergy recognized as the entity's refusal to relinquish its claim on the space. But the prayers continued, and eventually Lorraine reported the shift that indicated success. The resistance broke, the presence released, and the basement space was restored to neutral ground. The upper floors of the house required different attention. The accumulated residual energy from generations of previous occupants was addressed through a memorial prayer service, an acknowledgement of all those who had lived and died within the building across its century and a half of existence. Ed Warren considered this kind of memorial work both theologically sound and practically effective. The residual emotional energy that old buildings accumulate can serve as a resource for intelligent entities, and clearing that accumulated layer removes a source of power that adversarial presences use to maintain their influence over a location. The New Haven case concluded successfully, and the referring chaplain documented the outcome in his own records as confirmation that the Warren methodology could be effective even in urban academic environments, where skepticism might be expected to run high. Ed Warren's comfort operating in intellectually sophisticated contexts, his willingness to engage seriously with the rational frameworks that educated families brought to their paranormal experiences, made him particularly effective in cases like this one. He never dismissed analytical thinking as irrelevant to paranormal investigation. Instead, he demonstrated that rigorous investigation and spiritual understanding could work together to address phenomena that rational frameworks alone could not resolve. New Haven continued to produce cases that reached the Warren organization throughout their active decades, and the successful resolution of this investigation established a referral network within the university community that served as a reliable channel for reports of paranormal activity in the student and faculty populations. The city's long history, its layers of institutional and domestic life accumulating across centuries, created conditions where the past could intrude upon the present in ways that required more than historical scholarship to address. Some houses remember what happened within their walls, and some of those memories refuse to fade quietly into the background of ordinary domestic life. The New Haven haunting stands as evidence that education and intellect provide no immunity against the reality of forces that operate outside the frameworks academia typically acknowledges, and that sometimes the most rational choice an intelligent person can make is to recognize when rationality has reached its limits and other forms of knowledge must be consulted. Hashtags number Ed and Lorraine Warren, number New Haven haunting, number true horror stories, number paranormal investigation, number haunted house, number ghost stories, number paranormal, number haunted Connecticut, number Warren files, number demonic haunting, number real ghost stories, number creepy stories, number supernatural stories, number Vanishing Roads, number true paranormal. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented paranormal case files. All events reference real investigations by Ed and Lorraine Warren.